Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. The intent of this video is to kind of highlight which decks are both the most popular being played and then those that also have the highest win rate. With the background to help folks find deck lists, get ideas, to help them get into Mythic or high rank should they choose, or just to find a new brew to play for the format. This video will be for standard best of one. We'll cover best of three in the next video. If you're looking historic, Explorer, Alchemy, check out the playlist. We'll try to cover it all that week. Note with just historic and Explorer, since we're getting the anthologies this week, I'm skipping dedicated best decks videos and doing some brews for the new set for day one of the anthology release. So for all you folks looking for your Quarters Shield Tier 1 Pioneer port over deck list, stay tuned. I'm going to be recording that video this weekend. But we are focusing on standard best of one. We are going to be looking from the last week of data, but we're going to start things off with looking at the meta distribution. What are the most popular decks being played today in terms of volume of games? So one thing to always remember, volume of games in terms of a deck could be played a lot, but not necessarily correlate to a high win rate. This could be just access to wildcards, pet decks, stuff of that nature. So we always want to kind of differentiate between those and see what's happening, and also kind of look at the trend to see as the meta evolves each week. Are decks picking up in popularity, dropping off? Do you need to be conscientious of certain cards or certain archetypes to be prepared if you have to make tweaks to some of the flex spots in your deck? So look at the popularity for today. Don't worry about the date. We're looking Diamond to Mythic rank, and we're getting the data from UntapGG, companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client. Aggregates win rates for both yourself, so you can track your own win rates as well as other users, and then gives us cool stats. Link is in the video description below. I'll paste all the deck list timestamps. Don't worry about that. So Mono White Humans is the top deck of the format, just barely edging out the Mono Red Burn deck. You'll see Mono Red Burn, Mono Red Aggro. The kind of differentiation here, and we'll cover it, is the burn versions are usually on Mechanized Warfare and a little bit more burn focused package, where the Mono Red Aggro tends to be the creature heavier version. And those decks kind of flip-flop week to week in terms of overall effectiveness, as it's kind of correlated to what the meta is dictating. A big riser this week is actually Selesnya Enchantments. We've seen it drop off the last few weeks in terms of just overall net popularity. And we'll take a look in a sec, but it's had probably the biggest jump in terms of people bringing back the deck itself. Mono Black Midrange, Azorius Control, Mono Blue Tempo, and then 5-color Domain kind of round it up. If we're looking at kind of the trend graph, and I like this as a way to kind of see where things are at, we see the enchantment deck. It was hovering, around the double digits, dropped as low as like 7%-ish, mid 7s, and this week it's all the way back up to 11. So we've seen an increase over the last few days, and it's kind of interesting to see, like, enchantment players were having a bad week last week, or like the week before, and then they're starting to come up in terms of win rate. They dropped all the way down to 40% win rate, and then have slowly been climbing back up, which I like this type of stats. It gives a good visualization. Like, we've seen enchantments be as high as 23% of the meta when the most recent sets had kind of dropped. It picked up a lot in popularity, and now we're seeing them kind of normalize amongst the group. Nothing else seems like too significant. We're seeing the Mono Red Burn deck was the most popular last week, almost hitting 20%. Similar with humans, we've seen them kind of normalize. So the meta is kind of converging at a certain point where there's a lot more viable decks this week in terms of like a flattening of statistics. So we are going to look this week. We are going to look Diamond to Mythic rank July 8th through to the 15th. We have 47,000 games of Magic played. So the first deck we're going to look at is the Mono White Humans deck. So this is 64% win rate. It was also, as we saw, the highest played deck. So most played, highest win rate, people were out for it, but it still put up results. And the Humans deck, while they have some static features to it, there is some variability in terms of flex spots that are played. So the core of the deck is a human tribal deck. You're leveraging Coppercoat Vanguard as the Anthem effect that also provides ward ability. This makes it harder to kill your creatures. Guardian of Nubenalia, and then Thalia for tax effects. In past weeks, we've also seen Intrepid Adversary being played as a kind of pseudo-lord and then just a lifelink body. This has kind of fallen off this week, and they've moved more towards a Phyrexian Vindicator top end. As Vindicator is very good against decks that are combat-based. It's not as good against like sweepers or like black-based removal. So seeing that kind of shift in, this is like a nightmare for like mono red, Gruul, stuff like that. And like Gruul was a high-performing deck we saw last week that just is nowhere to be seen this week. So kind of a flash in the pan last week in terms of putting up some results. We have Hopeful Initiate as well as Recruitment Officer as your 1-drops, card advantage, blows up artifact enchantments, get bigger. This week it's also playing Lay Down Arms. Just a scalable removal spell, gives you some outs either to say like an opponent's Vindicator, Shieldred, any kind of big creature of that ilk. Adeline to go wide, Anointed Peacekeeper, ideally to try to tag those sweepers out of your opponent. We'll cover that like when we hit Azorius Control. And then Brutal Cathar as removal. Just very clean mana base. If you two have 22 planes, you can build this mana base with one Ijanjo. So if you like the aggro decks, something to consider in that respect. We then move to a deck that we haven't seen the last few weeks and is still kind of hovering around there, the Azorius Soldiers. So what I heard in like the comments last week, so we have some folks in the community that are fairly well versed and just enjoy the Soldiers archetype, but they've been commenting that the Soldiers have been getting hit pretty hard by the amount of Sunfalls in the format, which makes sense. This is kind of a go wide, spam the board deck that gets hit by those sweepers. But seeing it putting up results this week wasn't even in the statistics in terms of most played decks, so seeing some inclusion there. I wonder if we can add it in. Where is the Soldiers? So Soldiers represents 1.8% of the meta right now. So very few people playing Soldiers, but pretty much stock package. The Harbins to give your creatures like plus power and flying, resolute reinforcement for multiple bodies. The Valley attacks, you have the Lord and Valiant Veteran, Recruitment Officer Yodian as your 1-drops, Brutal Cathar is your removal, Valiant Veteran for counters, as well as making things hard to deal with. Sky Strike Officer, and then some top end Myrel of Argive, just kind of a must-kill threat. I think personally I'd still probably trim one of these to go the Sky Strike. Folks always tend to trim this, and I might be wrong, let me know in the comments, but I find that this card is one of the best cards in the deck. Aggro decks that draw cards tend to kind of do well, and I find like in the mirror, if you're just top decking and you could get multiple bodies, kind of go offense, defense. It's also the only kind of evasive creature outside of Harbin to kind of push through in case you get into board stalls. We then move to Mono Red Burn. So the Mono Red Burn is at 61% win rate. So as I mentioned, this deck is built around the Mechanized Warfare configuration. So this gives additional damage for each red or artifact source you control. That pairs with things like Ember Festivities, which would normally only deal 1 damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponent controls. But with the Warfare, each copy of Warfare makes it deal 1 instant or more. So if you say I have 2 Warfares out, well now it's basically Brotherhood's End that's one-sided. So helps in these creature mirrors where you can wipe your opponent's board while keeping your board intact. You'll also see in this version here Voldaren Epiture, a card that you don't typically see in the mono red creature build. This pings, which the ping can then deal extra damage. The looting is also valuable to just kind of get rid of cards you don't need. A couple Reckless Impulse for card advantage, and then you're pretty much stock package. Kumanos, Swiss Spears, Phoenix Chick, Play with Fire, Lightning Strike, and Squeeze mixed in. Another deck, 20 lands, so if you're looking like for a budgety deck to get into the format, this one's relatively cheap, all things considered. It's 7, 10 rares, 11 rares, no mythics. So it's a very easy to kind of get into the format. Even if you're short a couple Feldins, you can play like another Reckless Impulse. So it is something to kind of consider. This isn't crucial, but it does help your win rate a little in terms of Sokuzen. Not in terms of the next, in terms of sequential win rate. There's a couple of decks that were just edged it out, but I like to compare the 2 mono red decks back to back. So in terms of popularity, 110 matches, 1,300 matches. So more folks are playing the creature-based version of Mono Red Burn, or sorry, Mono Red, but this has got a slightly higher win rate between the two this week. this version here, so we see a lot of the similarities. Kumanos, Monastery Swiftspears, Phoenix Chick, Play of Fire. See the Reinforced Ronin, which gets around sweepers since it goes back to hand. It is a mana commitment each turn, so you don't actually progress your board state. That's the only downside with it. You have Strangles, which helps to deal with some of the creature decks of the format. Notably, this cannot go face, so it's the one card that can't. You still have your Bloodthirsty Adversaries, Feldins, Lightning Strikes, Furnace Rains to deal with big creatures out of your opponent's side, helps you ramp, squeeze, and Thunder and Raiju. The one thing I don't like about this configuration is the land count. While in this version here, I don't mind 20 lands given the density of 1-drops in the deck, as well as ways to kind of just cycle through. This version here has got a glut in terms of more expensive cards. Raiju, stuff like that. And then the thing too is like Bloodthirsty, you don't necessarily want to play it on 2. You'll play it as a 2-drop, but really this is something that you want to get value out of at 5 mana. And just in terms of consistency of hitting that 5 mana, especially because this version of the deck has no card draw whatsoever. So it's a little worse in that vein. Generally with something like this, I would probably say 22, maybe 23 lands would be a proper configuration, but people play mono red, they instantly think I play like the Sly decks, which are the very low to the ground, 1-drop heavy decks. This configuration is a little bit more mana hungry, so I would probably add a couple lands because you'll probably lose to mana base issues more than anything else. We'll then jump to mono black midrange, mono black control, sometimes it gets called. So this is at 60% win rate. So this is kind of the older school version, older school being like a couple months. We used to see Invoke Despair in this slot. We used to see sometimes Bankbuster, but the deck's playing your copies of Evolve Sleeper, Tenacious Underdog to come back, Liliana, Trespasser, kind of annoying cards. A lot of just powerful individual cards. The Flesh Gorger here is really going to be a 3-drop most of the time. This is going to give you a lifelinker to help combat with the more aggressive decks, while also just being a pain for your opponent to deal with. Notably, Flesh Gorger being an artifact, just can't get tagged by Go for the Throat, so it's very hard to deal with even in the mirror at times. Dick's Command can be served as a sweeper, have flexibility to return your creatures that you maybe discard with Liliana or just trade through combat. It also can give one creature just a big boost in terms of lifelink and counters, and then it can just deal with either like an individually large creature or a bunch of small creatures from your opponent's side. And how can we forget everyone's favorite card, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, the card that just sits there and deflates your opponent's hopes, dreams, aspirations. They draw a card, they just get bad times. We see the Mishra's Foundry in the mana base as well as Takenuma mixed into there. We'll then pop over to Azorius Control, so 59.8. We'll be generous. We'll give the control players the extra 0.2%, so 60% win rate. And what we have here is just a lot of Exile-based effects. We see like Wandering Emperor is your primary win condition, along with Jace that can be used for mill or card advantage. Faithful Mending can gain you some life and get rid of the wrong half problem. We also have a Depopulate in the mana base, Make Disappear. So these are kind of interesting. Spell Pierce in this type of deck. You usually see Spell Pierce in tempo-oriented decks, but given the nature of best of one, the decks tend to, like, we've seen low line count, so you might still be able to tag later in the game something like Mono Red or some of the creature decks. And then another card that I'm just kind of surprised to see here is Wash Away. You'll usually see like Dissipate. I think even just having another copy of Make Disappear might be more meaningful. While this does allow you to counter something for 1 mana if it wasn't cast from the opponent's hand, there's not like huge amounts of things. Like Memory Deluge can be tagged from the graveyard, stuff of that nature. But like if we're quickly looking, nothing really gets cast from the graveyard in the red deck or the humans deck. Nothing gets unearthed is an ability. It's not a cast effect. Same with the exile here. So it just seems like an odd choice there, where if you play something like Dissipate, you can just exile the effect. Soul Partition is targeted removal along with Elsa's Smite, and then you have Myrex that can also be served as a win condition in the mana base. Just keep making tokens. The Sunfall token also at times could just beat in if you say like exile 5 creatures from your opponent's side. Well, you got a 5/5 that might just be bigger than anything your opponent's doing. Selesnya Enchantments, biggest riser of the week, is at 58.8%. So this version here is the more aggressively slanted version. So we see it just topping out at Calyx and then a bunch of 2-drops. No Catilda, no the 3-mana exile effect. Just really looking to go lean, mean, and smack face. So Calyx is the big card of the deck, just lets you put counters on things and lets you copy enchantments. You have Jukai Naturalist for a cost reduction. Generous Visitor puts counters on things as well. Kami as a way to grow bigger. And then just ways to pump your team between Mashiko. You have removal and ossification. Audacity can give tramples. Skrelv is an interesting choice here for the targeted removal decks to allow you to just get protection, also pseudo unblockable. Double enter the battlefield effects with Weaver of Harmony and Spirited Companion for card draw. Mana base looking pretty lean. 22 lands is a reasonable amount. And this is another deck people like to skimp on, but I think 22, 23 is a good amount. The one thing, so I played a lot of this deck and I've had very varied amount of success and failure. Very much representative of that graph we saw. I've made top 1200 a couple months with it, having close to 75, 80% win rate. And then that same deck list, when the ladder reset, I was 45, 50% win rate. This deck is very contingent on what you're running into. It's individually powerful, but it is a synergy-based deck. So if your opponent does have a lot of interaction, even just seeing like the 4 strangles, a lot of cheap removal with pressure hurts, but also exile-based removals, very powerful. So like these Azorius Control decks playing Farewells and Depopulates and Sunfalls is really rough. This is an aggressive deck, but it does need to commit to the board to deal damage. There's no way for this deck to deal damage to your opponent without having an actual board state. Whereas with Mono Red, we saw they have 8 pieces of burn plus various ways to potentially buy back that burn. So you have reach in other forms, or just having ways with like creature lands, for example, to get damage through. But this is usually a deck I like. If it's doing well, then it's always something fun for me. I've liked the Naya runes, stuff of that nature. Speaking of Naya, we go to Naya Humans, 58% win rate. So this takes the core of the mono white humans deck, adds a very interesting mana base, just uses all your wild cards, but you use Plaza Heroes, so it's kind of got like a human sub-theme. A legendary sub-theme. And you get to take advantage of cards like Malira, which can be a protection spell. You also get Sigarda, Font of Blessings, which gives your other permanents hexproof and lets you cast humans from the top of your library. So with the mono white deck, once you kind of play out your hand, you're at a gas. With this Sigarda, it lets you get some more value in playing stuff off the top of your library. There's also backed up with Sigarda, Champion of Light, which is a Lord effect, as well as another way through Coven to potentially get card advantage. And then Halana and Alana, this is kind of a snowball-y card. If your opponent can't deal with it, well, every creature you cast gets at least +2. If you have Lord effects, even more. And then just gives haste and a whole bunch of value there. We see a lot of similarities. Adelins, Peacekeepers, Thalias, Coppercoat, all mixed into there. You also get the incidental protection through Plaza Heroes for some of your key legends. So whether it be Adelin, Thalia, Halana, any like your angels on the top end. You also have some Valorous stands for both proactive and reactive. So it can kill big things or protect your things from indestructible. And then finally, Esper Legends. This fell off the last couple weeks. See it in like the mid-50s. So this is a deck that's either, I find it's either towards the top in terms of percentage or like nowhere to be found each week. Kind of falling in the middle is an interesting spot for it. But you're playing Legends in terms of Rafine as the kind of engine. Lets you connive, sorts through your deck. When you draw a bunch of cards, you use Shieldred to gain a bunch of life. Make big creatures. Put lifelink, like big Denic lifelink in solo games. See the copies of Rona get reduced, and then going back up the copies of Thalia as kind of a tax effect. This deck does get hit hard, similar to the enchantments deck to sweepers, but you do have incidental ways to gain some life with, or like deal some damage, like just Shieldred sitting there. If they don't answer, it can be punishing. You do have some protection in Skrell for targeted removal. If it's just a normal sweeper, not exile, AO could find stuff. Technically have a couple counter spells in Urtai, but like a creature kind of, like a lot of these decks do tend to snowball. I've used that word a lot in this video, but it is a way to kind of like Skrelv into Thalia to Rafine could just win games on its own. Like 1, 2, 3 in this deck is very powerful, especially on the play. You get protection spells, as well as all the channel lines get cost reduction, so they're kind of spells. So that's why you see 28 lines. You're like, that's a lot for kind of creature mid-range. Well, think of a lot of these copies as spells for the deck itself. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, if you've been enjoying Standard. You'll see in the bottom left corner, we have a ticker 10K sub goal for the channel. We're trying to get there by the end of July. We're currently at 93.19. So if you haven't subbed to the channel, it's free, easy. We do these videos all the time for all the different formats. So if you want to keep up with what's changing in terms of the most effective decks, it's definitely a stop for you. If you have subbed, much appreciated. Likes, comments go a long way as well. Everything like that is all free, and it helps with exposure for the YouTube algorithm so we can get more folks into the community. In any case, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one, and stay safe out there.